The game of golf has been shaped by some pioneering figures whose brilliance out on the course often helped change the very nature of the sport itself. Golfing World's resident coach, Simon Holmes, has been looking back at the careers of some of these greats of the game. Today, it's the turn of six-time major champion Sir Nick Faldo, whose meticulous approach led the way for many of today's leading players.
Nick Faldo's introduction to golf was through watching the 1971 Masters and the images of Jack Nicklaus playing on the back nine at Augusta. And so Faldo would pretty much drop all of his other sporting interests to pick up the golf clubs. And an incredibly fast start. Only 3 years after starting the game, he was the English amateur champion. He was the British youth champion, and he would turn professional that next year and pick up a victory already in his first year as a professional. His second year as a professional golfer, he's the PGA champion on the European Tour. So an incredibly fast start. You know, Faldo was a very athletic guy, probably could have been a professional sportsman in 2 or 3 other disciplines, but it was golf that he selected. And he played in a sort of a golden era, especially the sort of the Seve Ballesteros era, where Seve had picked up his majors, Langer had the Masters, Lyle was already picking up some victories at the Open Championship. But for Faldo, he kept misfiring under this intense pressure. And so what he did, his sort of brain was to sort of break everything down, and he decided to completely rebuild his golf swing under the watchful eye of super coach David Ledbetter. Well, it was really the first time a player, a golfer, had ever gone to a third party and really allowed them to kind of completely remodel it. For 3 years, Faldo didn't win any tournaments at all, but he kept going. So first of all, I would say the discipline that Faldo had, the way that he thought about his game as just his swing was a tool for him to just propel the ball forward. It wasn't sort of a Seve kind of feel where it was in his blood. He had sort of the golf club was an extension of his body. For Faldo, it was much more systematic approach. He took apart his whole golf swing and he slowly rebuilt it. And when he came back together, it really came back together. He was the dominant force. And it all started for him in 1987. The Open Championship that year was going to be held at Muirfield, and on that last day, in pretty dire weather, Faldo would make his famous 18 pars in a row to win his first major championship, and it was the start of the Faldo era. He was the man to beat, and he would go on to have his first successes in America at Augusta, and he would go on with an incredible last round of 65 to squeeze into a playoff and narrowly beat Scott Hoke on the 11th hole. Again, the first player since Jack Nicklaus to defend his Masters the next year, again in a playoff with Ray Floyd. And so he started to become the person that everyone had their eyes on to defeat. A fantastic tournament at the Open Championship at St Andrews, and with a 66-64 opening first 2 days, he held the lead. Day 3, he's going out with probably his greatest rival at the time, Greg Norman. Nick Faldo would find this presence, this intimidation, and Greg Norman was unable to compete in his company. Faldo would go on to win by 5 shots and completely dominate the field. In 1992, Faldo would be back to his beloved Muirfield. Under huge pressure, the #1 player in the world, the person that everyone has got their eyes on. Could he handle the pressure as the home champion? Well, on the last day, with 5 or 6 holes to go, he is put under a huge amount of pressure by John Cook. Now, John Cook makes an unfortunate error on 17, but Faldo holds it together. He's got this sort of very, very strong mental side, reliable technique, and under the greatest of pressure, he makes a fantastic par, up 18 for his 3rd Open Championship. His game would sort of come in and out a little bit. He would still be the man to beat until we come to the 1996 Masters Championship. Faldo would play in the final round in the presence of Greg Norman, and being in that final group was incredibly important. Phil Mickelson that Saturday night had 3-putted to not get into the last group, and it made a huge difference. Faldo, I think, knew he had a chance if he could actually see Greg Norman, and Greg Norman could see those cold blue eyes. Well, Greg was 6 shots ahead and Faldo, through his methodical and brilliant play, would slowly break him down and change that around. So it was Greg Norman's 78 to Faldo's 67, one of the greatest performances under pressure. I never forget that 2-iron that Nick Faldo played off that big side slope, that bank on 13 up onto the green. He knew he had to get that club up there. The wood that he had selected initially wasn't going to be the right shot. That faded 2-iron for me showed who Faldo was, how good his game was under pressure, and that he was, at his best, the best in the world. So despite the criticism that he had for going and changing his swing, he was the guy who made the tour coaches. It was the first professional relationship between player and coach. And if we look at the modern game, all the best players in the world have got all of the best coaches in the world with them on every shot, and that is the Faldo influence.